Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the May 9th, 2023 meeting of the Dallas Planning Commission. I'm calling this meeting to order. My name is John Swanson, the president of the commission, and we will have the roll call next, please.
John Swanson,
Here.
Andy Grow,
Here.
Mary Newell,
Here.
Tori Banford,
Here.
Carol Kowash,
Here.
Rich Spofford,
Here.
John Schulte.
Here.
Quorum is present.
Thank you. We will proceed to approval of the minutes. We've all looked over the minutes that were included in our packet, the regular meeting minutes from April 2023. I do not remember the specific date. April 11th. Has everyone read the minutes, and are there any corrections, directions for staff, or can we entertain a motion to accept the minutes as read?
So moved.
Accept the minutes.
It's gonna be a long meeting.
Yeah, moved and seconded to approve the minutes. Thank you. And I see that I have them to sign right here afterwards. Sometimes I forget that. I appreciate that. Next item on the agenda is public comment.
Do you want to vote?
What's that?
You want to vote?
I thought it was, okay, let's vote on the
No, you
minutes. I apologize. Last month I was flustered. This month I'm not. So now I'm just being lazy. So let's have just a poll vote on the approval of the minutes. All those in approval of the minutes as written by staff for the April 11th meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same. Unanimously passes. Thank you. Item number 4 on our agenda is the public comment period. This is an opportunity for citizens to speak on items that are not on the agenda this evening. We've got 2 items on the agenda. So if there's anybody here that would like to address the Planning Commission on items not on our agenda this evening, now's your time. Do we have anyone on Zoom or the phone?
No callers.
Thank you. We'll now move on to agenda item number 5, which is public hearings. This is a public hearing for variance number 2301. And you'll excuse me while I read through the script to make sure that we do all this properly and legally. And well, I was going to bring that up. Okay, sorry. I was going to bring that up. So this public hearing is regarding property located at 192 Southeast Lockreal Drive. This is an official public hearing before the Dallas Planning Commission, and I now declare this public hearing open at 7:05 p.m. As the application is subject to land use proceedings recognized by state law, I will read the following statement. The failure to raise an issue with sufficient detail to afford the commission and the parties an adequate opportunity to respond to each issue precludes appeal to the State Land Use Board of Appeals based upon that issue. Please direct all testimony to the record and the applicable criteria listed in the staff report, or to criteria in the Dallas Development Code you believe applies to the decision. The applicable approval criteria are found in code chapters, staff.
1.040
Yes.
for variance and 4.3.07 over the partition.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
At this time, I'll ask if any members of the Planning Commission have a conflict of interest, a site visit, or an ex parte contact to declare. If you have, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll proceed. This hearing will be conducted in the following manner. We will begin with a staff report, followed by questions of staff. Thereafter, we will hear from the applicant, including members of the applicant team, for a total of 15 minutes. This may be followed by questions from the Planning Commission. Thereafter, we will hear from all other interested parties in presenting testimony on the item before the commission. Each person will be provided 5 minutes to testify. We will then provide the applicant with 5 minutes for rebuttal. After we have heard all testimony, I will close the hearing and ask the commission to deliberate, and then ask if there is a motion in response to this proposal. In this case, the commission's decision is final unless the decision is appealed. At this time, we'll start with the staff report. May we please have the staff report?
And if I may, just again, for the record, we should clarify that this hearing is on petition PTN 2301 as well as variance.
So we are considering both the variance and the partition
Yeah.
concurrently at this hearing. Thank you for the clarification. So staff, may we have your presentation?
Indeed, yes. And I apologize, when I was putting my staff report together, I had forgotten that the partition was also rolled into this, so I don't have the slides for that, my apologies. So for the variance, they're doing a partition and requesting a variance to the following standards for driveways. The first is under the access spacing section in chapter 3.1, which specifies a minimum separation of 50 feet between driveways as measured center line to center line. The second code section is under chapter 4.3, the land divisions chapter, the reference for flag lots and non-street fronting lots, which specifies that shared driveways shall either be part of the lot farthest from the public street or a separate tract owned in common by all lots receiving access, such as a homeowners association. In this instance, the land division is proposing to have an easement across the individual lots, with each lot owning a portion of the driveway, but not having a single ownership of that driveway. So really, I think that code section was, I think, really intended more to kind of prevent the land division when you have like a bunch of spaghetti lines that all kind of feed out to the street. But the way that it's written, of course, would seem to preclude the way that the applicant is proposing it as well. So thus the reason for the variance, even though it doesn't seem to pose any actual harm to doing so. For the variance, there's essentially 5 primary criteria. The variance is necessary because the subject code provision does not account for the special unique circumstances of the site. Variance is the minimum necessary to address those circumstances. There's special provisions, and so we'll come to that in the next slide. The variance does not conflict with city policies and results in no foreseeable harm to adjacent property owners or the public. There are 8 special approval criteria for variances to vehicular access and circulation standards. There's not adequate physical space for shared access. No other alternative access points exist from other streets. Access separation requirements cannot be met. Again, minimum request to meet the need. The variance would still result in safe access to the street, meets the vision clearance requirements, and the road authority approves of the variance. So those are kind of the approval criteria that we have for variances. Going into detail from the applicant's materials, staff concur that the approval criteria are met for that driveway variance, and are recommending approval. For reference, the location is 192 Southeast Loch Riel Drive. So here's a vicinity photo. You can see there's currently a duplex on the front of the property. The rear of the property is largely undeveloped. And so the proposal is to have a shared driveway on the south side of the property, which would serve 2 new lots. In this instance, showing proposed duplexes on those lots, which is an allowed use in that zone. And so you can see the shared driveway there on the south side would not meet the 50-foot spacing standard to the existing driveways, both for the existing property and the property to the south. But due to the location of the existing duplex, there really isn't other feasible locations to put said driveway. So seems to be warranted to grant the variance in this instance. As far as the land division approval criteria, those all appear to be met. The lots meet the minimum lot size for the zone, the minimum density standards for the zone. So no real concerns on the lot division standpoint. Although, like I said, I don't have specific slides addressing that. My apologies. So yeah, staff report shows that with the conditions of approval, all the criteria can be met. And so standard conditions of approval on that, submitting a final partition plat within 2 years of the order. meeting all the city standards at the time of development. And specifically, roof drains, connected to the city's storm system so that you're not, directing water onto other properties. So with that,
Was that, was that slide the plat, was that the preliminary plat that you showed us?
yes, that's the site plan,
Okay.
and that should be in the packet, is it not?
Yes.
So it is.
Okay. Scared me for a moment.
All right.
It's,
It's a big packet, so I.
it's the
appreciate
very
that.
last page.
Got it. Okay, there is. Good.
This section, yeah.
All right.
Okay. Questions for staff before we turn it over to the applicant?
Normally, I would allow other commissioners. I just want a clarification question. Under a circumstance by which a variance is not required, this partition would be an administrative decision and not before the planning commission. Is that correct?
Yes, ordinarily, land divisions of 3 or fewer lots are administratively processed and don't come to planning commission. Normally, planning commission only sees land divisions of 4 or more, unless a variance is needed, in which case it does come to the planning commission as along with the variance application.
Sir,
It would not be possible to approve the land division without the variance. And so it makes no sense to process them on separate tracks since they are part and parcel together.
understand. I just wanted to make that point clear to everyone that the reason that we are, and it was left off, that's why I'm saying that. The reason that we're also discussing the partition is because the variance is required to permit the partition to occur. And that's why we're considering them together.
Yes.
Are there any planning commissioner questions regarding the staff report? Hearing none, let's proceed. Applicant, please step forward. State your name and your address for the record, and you have 15 minutes to present your application to the Dallas Planning Commission. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natalia Izquierdo. I'm an engineering designer with Lock Engineers, which is the firm that is working through this preliminary plat. And as Chase stated, we are partitioning a lot into 3 different lots to put 2 new duplexes in. And our study of the code has revealed that there's no real problems except what was stated before. And we are just looking for approval to get that in motion. I don't know if there's much.
Okay. Thank you. Do any planning commissioners have any questions for the applicant?
I do if no one else does.
Well, Andy, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering about, I'm understanding that the easement for the access is each individual parcel has a part of that easement or a part of that driveway, and they're separately owned. And I recognize that you've got to give the existing duplex allowing it's got to keep that piece of property, otherwise it won't meet setback and other things. My only concern is how are you handling maintenance of the access easement? Because when it's in separate ownership, if one part falls apart, or the other 2 people maintain their piece and one is not maintained, it's difficult for the city to enforce that on just a piece of that. Is that addressed at all in your partition?
I don't think we have gotten to that point yet, but I'm sure it will be addressed as we progress.
I know in prior.
Oh, come if you're gonna speak, say your name on the record. Yeah.
It's David Ernst.
You can pull up a second chair and you can both sit there, certainly.
One
Please
second.
state your address for the record.
Oh, my address, it's 3240 Ashford Street, Northwest Salem. Can I go ahead now?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. Sorry.
That's right. So the one we've done in the past that's had this situation, what we've done is put that with the deed so that the maintenance is with both properties.
All three properties?
It would just be the two, because the first one is access is blocked all without this driveway. Correct?
Yes, but the part from the existing duplex is on a separate piece of property. So they're required to, you can put it in there so that the back two properties can maintain that piece without the first person isn't required to include in the maintenance of it because they don't use it. Is that what you're saying?
I believe that's correct. That
Okay,
their only access would be, where the driveway is existing right now, that property would be separate. The easement would be separate from that property.
but it's part of the property because there was a note that said it would prevent parcel one from complying with the lot width standard. So that lot has to have that piece of property with the access easement on it. So it is part of the property, correct?
Okay, so it is.
Yeah,
Part of our.
yeah. And then we're gonna have a deeded maintenance agreement or of sorts for. taking care of that.
You could add that as a condition, a maintenance agreement being recorded.
Okay, and
Exactly.
it basically would
Oh, it
be,
is, I don't see it.
Oh, no, in the land division section.
Oh, okay, all right, it's not a specific, okay.
It's a final plat review.
Oh, okay, all right.
so it is in there?
We could add that as a condition of approval.
Okay.
Make that more explicit, but yes, there
I
is a
would-
code requirement for that.
And that maintenance agreement would be for the rear two properties and that works?
However they want to set it
Because
up.
they're the ones who are who need it. So, and they've got access because they've got the easement over the other piece of property, so. Okay, that makes 50-50. That's a lot easier than 33 and a third.
Well, we'll make sure that Lane helps us word the condition of approval correctly, because I think it is important that all three property owners are cooperative and legally bound to respect this easement that's being established with this partition. Are there any other questions for the applicant from the planning commission?
One other quick one.
Go for it.
Just, this is an easy one, it's softball. You're requiring the roof drains go out to the street. That's because it's so long. Is there enough fall to get water from all the way in the back out to, I don't know where the storm drain is. Have you, I assume you've investigated the depth of it and you can get the water out there?
Yeah, we have two options that we went through, so we have two options that we talked about. One is to try to get easements on the backside from other properties. Which I'd rather not, so I'd rather stay on it, and since we already have an agreement with easements. We would do the same as the storm with the catch basin pump system that would pump all the water from the housing.
Okay,
Oh, the overflow and low points, I guess.
okay.
And it will all go into the city storm system.
Correct.
Okay. Yes, please.
On the recommended conditions of approval, it says that, the partition plat will be approved within 2 years of this order. Is it your plan to do that before you build the properties or after?
But
To set up the final partition plat? When do you plan to do that?
I believe we plan on doing that right away.
Okay, thank you. And you plan to get rid of that?
Yeah, they'll be required to demonstrate final plat before building permits can be issued.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent.
Cool.
We have another questions, of the applicant? Yes.
I noticed that you got a single sewer lateral that serves both houses. I assume that's okay with city code to do that? That you
That's
don't
an
need
excellent question. Okay.
Separate sewer laterals for each property?
I am not the public utilities bureau, so Tom Gilson, if you want to speak on that.
We would require individual, so they're gonna create two.
I think we do have well, showing, I'm not sure if you're looking at the preliminary utility map, that's what you're doing. Yeah. But we got full lines for what for each.
The very last map shows it. It shows all the laterals.
Thank you.
So there's
Actually-
on there too, correct? So That's where we put the, catch basin instead of the rain garden.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gilson. Are there any other planning commissioner comments or questions for the applicant?
Now you made me look at this map.
Okay,
You're showing your storm drain going to the back of the lot, not to the street.
So we asked to go to the rain garden.
Oh, there's a rain garden back there?
But, we're not being allowed to do that. Yeah.
So it'll basically either go through an easement to the back and you'll do that at the time you get the partition, or will that be at the time of construction?
We're gonna set it up to pump to lock it off.
Okay,
What we're gonna do.
and do we allow pumped storm drain?
Want to maintain them.
Okay,
so for the record, the rain garden at the rear or the eastern end of the property is no longer in play, and all of the storm water is going to be pumped out to the storm system in Lock Rill. Thank you. Any other planning commissioner questions on this proposal? Application, sorry. Hearing none, we will now hear from those in attendance tonight who would like to address the planning commission on this item. Please raise your hand if you would like to testify. Thank you
thank
very
you.
much. Anyone here like to speak on this issue? Hearing none, we would now normally allow the applicant 5 minutes to rebut anything that was said by anyone providing testimony, but since that's not in play here tonight, we will ask if there are any final comments from staff or the city attorney on the application before this evening.
If you wanted to add a condition of approval, I've just got language that the applicant will record a road maintenance agreement between parcels 2 and 3 for the access easement, subject to city approval.
Sounds good.
And are we not making
Number one doesn't have to.
lot number one doesn't have to, but lot number one also cannot,
No, lot number 1 can use the easement. It's.
right, but
still
they
lot number
can't
one
terminate
property.
the easement.
Right,
for
no,
the two and
no,
three.
they cannot.
Okay,
Because
excellent,
it's a permanent easement to the other two lots.
excellent, excellent. Okay, for the good of the order, are there any more comments from commissioners, from staff? If not, I will now declare this public hearing closed at 7:25 PM. This is an opportunity now. Is there a motion by the planning commission, or is there any discussion that we'd like to have before a motion is made this evening? Andy?
Looks good to me.
Okay, okay. I have no comments or additional questions, and if there's no more discussion, we will entertain a motion for this proposal for the variance and also for the partition, including the condition that Lane has prepared for us.
Yes.
I move the amended motion, including the added recommended condition number 4. To approve the application for variance and partition with the conditions stated in the staff report.
Thank you. And would we like to hear the added condition one more time?
Please.
You know, then. No, I can read it, just, the applicant will record a road maintenance agreement between parcels 2 and 3 for the access easement, subject to city approval. That means the agreement will be between parcels 2 and 3.
Right.
So we have a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
I'll second.
The motion has been made and seconded, including the fourth condition of approval. Let's have a roll call vote. And I'll go last.
Okay. John Schulte,
Yes.
Rich Spofford,
yes.
Carol Kowash,
Yes.
Tori Banford,
Yes.
Mary Newell,
Yes.
Andy Grow,
Yes.
John Swanson.
Yes. Thank you very much. The variance and the partition have been granted. I'm sure that there's some language here that I'm supposed to read. The motion passes, carries unanimously. An order reflecting the commission's decision tonight will be mailed to the applicant and to all participants of record within 10 business days. So thank you very much. Thank you, applicants. Thank you, staff. I think we handled that perfectly. Thank you.
This next one is not a public, meeting, but it is deliberation.
Correct. I'll wing it on this one.
Yeah.
Okay, our next agenda item, folks, is a continuation of a public hearing that we held in April. This is a type 4 land use decision, which means the planning commission decision is a recommendation to city council. These are legislative amendments to the Dallas City Code, legislative update number 2201. At the last public hearing, we heard testimony. We allowed the public record to remain open for 7 days. And we closed the public hearing at the end of those 7 days. So this evening, what we will do is deliberate upon and vote upon the legislative amendments after the staff report. Has there been any testimony received in the 7 days after the hearing?
There was not.
There was not. So we left the record open for 7 days following the closure of the public testimony part. So now what we will do is we will hear a staff report on the legislative code updates, and then we will deliberate and vote on it. So staff, please, if we could have a report.
So I don't have a PowerPoint prepared for this because it's a lot harder to do a PowerPoint on text amendments than it is on actual proposals. So
Well, walk us through it.
indeed.
We've
well,
got lots of reference here.
Yeah, so we have lots of reference there. Again, we've been in this process for a while. We've had several rounds of public testimony. So as a matter of completeness, I wanted to provide you with essentially the entire record thus far. In a few instances, we've gotten folks who have taken the multi-page proposal and then annotated the margins, which is not an ideal way to provide testimony because then we have to include all of those pages and the whole thing just balloons in size until it's a fun book. But that's why it's so thick. So really what you're concerned with is the actual proposed changes that are at the beginning of that packet. And the staff report does go into some detail on kind of what those proposals are. And so I can certainly walk us through those as we go. We did also receive some testimony from like public. And so there was some response at the beginning of the staff report to that testimony. So I don't know how much the commission wants to go over that since it's not really currently part of the proposal. Although certainly commission could add that if commission so chooses. So kind of beginning us through the process, we're adding several new definitions to the code. So recreational vehicle parks is an interesting one. It's in the definitions section, not the use categories. So moving that to the correct section of code, adding a few changes here and there to make it a little more logical in terms of formatting. That's pretty straightforward. That'd be page 1 there of the packet of changes. Most of that is just copy and paste from the actual definition section, but there, like I said, there are some tweaks to that. Also adding a new category for park and ride. This was kind of created whole cloth because we specify zones where park and rides are allowed, but we don't specify what a park and ride is. So adding a definition for what a park and ride is, again, created out of whole cloth, so that didn't come from anywhere in particular. It was kind of my own brainchild on that. So that's kind of the new definitions that we're adding. Let's see, so walking through the list, we're also updating the definition for agriculture. Specify that it's agriculture, for commercial profit, to differentiate that from like your hobby farms and whatnot. As we try to move the animals out of the zoning code and put them into city code. That kind of left us with the question of what is agriculture then? So we kind of added that little bit of extra clarification on that. Okay, so next kind of major category we had was cottage clusters. We've yet to actually have any developments in town that are cottage clusters, but we do have some code language that would allow that. This kind of redefines what those are, or I guess clarifies the definition. It puts the definition actually in the definition section and adds it to the section where you calculate housing density. So that's trying to bring the whole thing full circle into the way the code is written. We're also proposing to up the current limitation on how many units can be in a cottage cluster. Right now, a cottage cluster is 2 to 4 cottages on a single piece of property. But there's nothing saying that you couldn't have multiple pieces of property next to each other, which have a whole bunch more than just 4. So trying to address that loophole by saying, you don't have to divide up the property, you can have more than just 4. And that seems to be kind of the best practices that we've seen in some of the reports that have been made. So that's kind of where that change comes from. We're also updating the accessory dwelling standards. Right now, accessory dwellings have to meet the same setbacks as full-size houses. That's been problematic when people are trying to convert existing structures, and the commission here has seen several variance requests related specifically to that topic of accessory dwellings in existing structures. So getting rid of that code requirement and specifically allowing additional exceptions when you have existing structures that are being converted. That way we'll be able to facilitate more of those ADUs without having to bring a whole bunch of variances to the planning commission. We don't do a lot of ADUs each year, but we do a couple. And so to the extent that we can facilitate that, make it a little smoother. Housing variety standards is going to be our biggest change in kind of that chapter 2. So housing developments of 20 or more currently have to score a certain number of points. And the code currently outlines 3 ways that points can be scored. What we've heard from developers who are trying to do like missing middle kind of housing, where you have your townhomes, your duplexes, your accessory dwellings. The housing variety standards don't really account for that. And actually really kind of penalize you if you're trying to do a bunch of small townhome sized lots. Because one of the main ways of scoring points is by having lots that are smaller than a percentage of the median. Well, if you have really small lots for townhouses, the median then gets really, really small, and that's unachievable in many instances. So adding specifically a new category for scoring points of that kind of missing middle housing, the duplexes, the triplexes, those sorts of things. We're also updating procedurally how those reservations are established. The way that we've been doing them in practice has been to have deed restrictions so that the actual home builders have to abide by those requirements. And so actually codifying that process, which currently isn't in code, but we've been doing it that way. So yeah. And then also some adjustments to the affordable housing criteria as well. Going down the list, agriculture, again, trying to take animals out of the category of development code, put them in municipal code, makes it a lot easier to enforce for code enforcement. Self-storage, probably one of the more controversial sections of code that we're looking to add. We had some testimony from the EDC that they wanted to see some restrictions placed on self-storage units. We don't necessarily want to have our entire city filled with self-storage. It seems to be a very profitable business, but doesn't really create a lot of jobs or add much to the local economy or the tax base. And so we're looking to establish some new standards on self-storage facilities. I'll be honest, a lot of that was kind of copy pasted, kit bashed from Gardenia, California, and also Vancouver, Washington. As I was Googling around, those seem to be kind of ones that just came up. So I tried to take those and adapt them to the Dallas context as best we could. We don't have, for example, major transit streets here in town because we don't have much in the way of transit. So there were some massaging to make that really fit more of the Dallas context, but that's kind of where that came from. Looking to establish multi-story requirements, place limitations on the overall acreage of self-storage facilities, and also place siting requirements, having to be a certain distance from other self-storage facilities. Again, to prevent that kind of loophole of dividing the land and then building two things that are identical next to each other, thus circumventing the lot size limitation. As well as spacing them away from the major arterials, so that we can kind of preserve that, roadway capacity for facilities that actually produce a lot of traffic. There's no point in having a multi-lane road if all you're going to build there is a self-storage thing, right? So that's probably one of the more controversial proposals that we've added. The packet included letter of testimony back from the EDC. We took it back to them. They said essentially we don't like this proposal, but they didn't specify what they wanted to see instead. So I'm not a mind reader, so do with that what you will. Historic preservation, chapter 2.10. We're renaming the Landmark Commission. We're also adding a bunch of language from the model code that was provided to us from the state. So not a whole lot of commentary on that, just kind of trying to modernize that section of the code, make it easier to have grant funding and those sorts of things if we're more consistent with the state model code. Pedestrian access, chapter 3.1 and 3.4. So this starts to get into a sort of an issue that we're seeing throughout the code, where the code contains discretionary language, things like we may require. When we have that discretionary language, LUBA has had some interesting rulings regarding the enforceability of that, who gets to decide what that is. There's state law that requires codes regulating needed housing, which has since been defined to be all housing, has to be clear and objective. And so when you say something may be required, that's not clear and objective. Is it required? Is it not required? So trying to remove some of that discretionary language from the code kind of throughout. Obviously, we're not going to rewrite the entire code in one go. So this is kind of the first shot at that. We'll update other sections as we update other sections in future processes. So specifically with regards to pedestrian access, we're looking to remove some of that discretionary language, make the pedestrian access more mandatory, as well as clarify, what the standards actually are for it. We're also looking to consolidate some of the widths for walkways. There are a whole bunch of different widths for walkways that vary depending on what zone the walkway is in, what kind of use it is serving. Is it a public walkway? Is it a private walkway? Is it a park or leading to a park? Is it connecting between cul-de-sacs? There's a whole bunch of different standards for walkways. And so looking at the code more holistically, trying to consolidate that down into really two main buckets or two main sizes, I guess we would say. And so essentially that's a 6-foot width for most circumstances, and then a wider 12-foot width where multi-use paths like the are called for. So that clarifies in a lot of ways which width a walkway would need to be. Because you don't then have to look at, a dozen different sections to figure out which one is which. Had some interesting testimony on that one. One of the main questions that kind of came up was, well, why don't you just, defer to the ADA on walkway standards? Well, ADA is like the minimum. I don't think people come to Dallas because we meet minimum, right? We're definitely wanting to have, I think, a higher standard. ADA requires that an access way exist, doesn't require that it be good. And there's also a bunch of, exceptions and loopholes in ADA. So if one of those comes into play, is it required or not? So again, clear and objective, it's required. I don't know if I should keep going or if I should pause here and get questions. I'll defer to the chair's thinking on that. I'm about halfway through, I would say.
Do we have any questions for staff so far?
I do. If I may.
Please.
Just help me with the context. We had a meeting last month. We allowed 7 days for additional input, of which there was none. Now we have some supplemental information. Is any of this subject to public comment?
It was submitted as part of the record. It came in, could have been commented, the staff report is not subject to public comment. It's for you for deliberation.
And the language in the code has not changed since last month's proposal. So whatever was presented last month, that is still the amendment that is proposed. This is just trying to provide more of an explanation as to why the changes are proposed, why these specific changes are proposed as they are, I guess, provide additional context to decision making. And I don't think that specifically would be something that would be.
The major point to me was an opportunity was given for additional input, or was
Correct. And there will be further opportunity as well, because it does go to the city council as part of a second public hearing. So any changes to the code that commission is proposing, modifications of the proposal here, there'd be opportunity for public testimony on those changes at the city council level. So there'll be further opportunities.
Yeah, that could have been a consideration for some people not to put additional testimony in to let the commission move this along and they can deal with their issues further with the council.
Thank you.
Hard to say.
Any other questions? Andy?
Regarding walkway widths. I remember the engineer who was here last month. Was concerned about, and I guess. If 6 foot is the minimum width other than 5 foot for sidewalks. Does that include like little 3-foot walks that go from the house to the sidewalk and things like that? Are those regulated under this code?
They are not.
Okay.
So there is specifically an exception under chapter 3.1 for single family dwellings.
So these are,
1 and 2 family, I think is the way it's phrased.
so these are just multifamily,
Commercial.
that kind of thing. In that case, I just have one more question about that. I know in Salem, they require 8-foot public sidewalks adjacent and on the way to schools. Have we ever considered something like that for children's safety?
So we're getting ready to do a transportation system plan update. We've been told there is grant funding that has been funded. We've yet to actually see the consultant on this one, so although we're told that it's paid for, we yet to see anything. So who knows how long this will take, but we are doing a TSP update, and that is, I think, specifically one of the items for discussion at that time is what sort of sidewalk standards do we want, and does that vary by zone? If you look downtown, we've got 10-foot sidewalks, and we've spent a lot of money making really nice, really wide sidewalks. And nowhere in the code does it say if you're doing downtown development, you do a 10-foot sidewalk, even though that's what the rest of it is. And it would seem logical because that's where you have the most pedestrian activity. So I think there is some room as we go through that TSP update process to kind of reevaluate the public street standards. And that's why we haven't proposed changing the actual numerical standard for public streets in this go around, because there will be that follow-on process, which will probably have a whole bunch more changes to the code than just that one
I'll
section.
keep that one in my pocket. then. Did we get to bicycle parking yet, or is that next?
That is next.
Okay, I'll save that question for later.
I have another question. You mentioned the TSP update that's coming. What's the process for updating the TSP in terms of approval? That's just for clarification for the folks that are here, for the planning commissioners.
Yes, so the TSP, the Transportation System Plan, it is officially part of the city's comprehensive plan. It's, I don't want to say an appendix, it's more important than an appendix, but it is essentially a part of the comprehensive plan. And so as such, modifying the TSP is essentially a comp plan amendment. And so it's a legislative process. And so there'd be at least one hearing in front of the city planning commission. You'd make recommendation to the city council for approval. Obviously, there'll be a public involvement process kind of in advance of that, whether that's open house, town hall, that part, I don't know yet. Like I said, it's been funded, but we've not actually had conversations yet on making it happen. So
Your consultant will walk you through.
our consultant will walk us through that, I'm sure. So, yeah, that's kind of what the process is, just like the other legislative changes, other comp plan amendments, you'll see it first and then go to city council.
Sir, thank you. Any other questions to this point, or shall we allow staff to continue? Let's go on.
Okay, well, I will keep talking then. So bicycle parking. This one seems to have generated some amount of controversy. I don't quite understand why, but that's fine. The big change really relates to residential parking for multifamily uses. Currently, the standard is 1 parking space for every 20 apartments. If you propose that for automobile parking, they'd laugh at you. So the fact that that's the standard for bicycle parking is, I think, quite insufficient. So we're proposing to up that to 1 bicycle parking space for every dwelling. Or 1 parking space for every automobile parking space, unless there is no automobile parking, such as in the downtown, in which case it becomes 1 per unit. We're also creating certain exceptions for disabled housing, senior housing, those sorts of facilities. Logically, there'd be less of a need for bicycle parking at those kind of places. And then we're also establishing minimum design standards. Right now, we don't really have a lot of design standards in terms of what is a bike rack and how big of a space is required for that bike rack. And so you see a lot of not great installations when that's kind of the case, or having a more definitive code. The big part is requiring a minimum dimensional standard for the space. 2 foot wide, 6 foot deep, kind of your standard parking space for a bicycle. And then specifying that the bicycle rack would need to support the bicycle at 2 points. When you're only supporting the bicycle at 1 point, like leaning against a pole, for example, the bikes can fall over and be damaged. So supporting it at 2 places, like you have with kind of that hoop style of rack, makes it less likely for the bikes to be damaged. Having the wider parking space as well also helps prevent damage, because you can then get your bike in and out of the space without your handlebars scratching other bikes. So kind of the idea of preventing damage in that dimensional standard. Also having a higher standard for like apartment, multifamily tenant resident parking. Because those places, you'll often have bikes parked for a longer period of time. You go to Safeway, you park there for, 20 minutes while you're shopping, maybe all day if you're an employee who works there. But if you're living in an apartment, that bike could be parked for 6 months because it's rainy and wet outside. Like, that's not an unreasonable expectation, right? And so having a higher standard for that multifamily kind of bicycle parking, having it enclosed, protected from the elements so that it's not being stolen, it's not being rained upon, not being damaged by the sun and the rain. Kind of a big consideration, right? So that's kind of where those standards come from. The actual, impact of that, I would imagine, is pretty minimal. We also have not seen much in any multifamily development here in town in the last 15 years, so it'd be nice to have some rules on the books before some gets built, but also, is there any that's going to be built? Who knows? So moving on, street standards. So right now, our local street standards specify a 5-foot sidewalk and a 5-foot landscaping strip, or utility strip, or however you want to phrase that. It does not really specify the order in which those are placed within the right of way. There is a typical illustrative graphic in the TSP. We do have some engineering standard drawings in the Public Works Department. But we also have lots of developers who have done other things because the code again doesn't really specify. Having the landscaping placed between the sidewalk and the curb offers a lot of advantages. It makes ADA compliance a lot easier because you can have your driveways, you can have your curb ramps, not interfere with the level space of the sidewalk. It gives you a place to put garbage cans so that you're not blocking the sidewalk, those sorts of things. So there are lots of benefits to having that landscape strip between the curb and the sidewalk. So currently the proposal is to make that essentially be the standard for new street construction and major remodel constructions. So that's that. Now that does present something of a question. Because when you do have the side of the landscape strip between the curb and the sidewalk, that then pushes the sidewalk all the way up to the property line. And so currently we have a 20-foot setback from the garage openings to the property line. If that property line now is also where the sidewalk is, that gives you 20 feet from the garage door to the sidewalk. Which is not necessarily enough to fit a really large pickup truck, of which there are a lot here in Dallas. So in order to prevent vehicles or reduce the likelihood of vehicles overhanging the sidewalk, we are proposing to increase that garage opening setback from 20 feet to 25 feet. That way you have additional space from the garage to the sidewalk. Since this does slightly reduce the buildable envelope of the lot, the commission might want to consider offsetting that either by reducing the front setback for the main part of the house, or reducing rear yard setback, something to offset that. Staff haven't really made a proposal on that, but if that was something that the commission thought would be worthwhile, certainly it's something that could be proposed. So yeah. So next section that I have here on my list, public dedications. And so again, this gets at that whole discretionary language, clear and objective standards. So there's a whole bunch of language on public dedication specifically related to like parks and open space, trails, those sorts of things. And so rewording that to make it essentially more mandatory, taking out that, may be required kind of language. No, it will be required. This is in many ways a regulatory taking, or actually an actual taking, not a regulatory taking. It's a taking. But so is the existing standard if it was actually enforced. There are constitutional limits to the government's ability to do takings. Nolan versus City of Tigard and Dolan v. California Coastal Commission. Did I mix those up? Okay, right. I'm sorry. Anyway, so there are limits on kind of what kind of exactions that we can require from developers. And so if an exaction is unconstitutional, we're obligated not to require that because doing so would violate their constitutional rights. So having this mandatory language is beneficial because it then allows us to say, hey, you have to do this, there's no wiggle room, while still having that out of, oh, we can't require this of you because it's unconstitutional. So there is still that safeguard. It's not an unlimited taking. Yeah. Was that clear? I don't know that I said that very clearly. Was that clear enough?
The Constitution limits the extent of the taking that we can require.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. In that case, I'll keep going. Sign codes. There's two changes to the sign code. The first is introducing an exception or an allowance for campaign signs. The previous sign code had an allowance for that. The section that it was in was deleted. I don't think getting rid of that was the intention, and so we're adding that back in. The city council did enact like an emergency ordinance, basically preempting the sign code in order to allow that for the more recent elections. So it is that ordinance would be repealed as part of the sign code update. The second amendment to the sign code is regulating temporary signs in the public right of way at street corners. Currently, that's prohibited, and so this would remove that prohibition as we have not been enforcing that. So it essentially matches the code to the current enforcement practice. Medical centers, that's a use that's defined in the code, but most of the sections don't list which zone it's allowed or not allowed in. So adding that as a conditional use in all of the zones. When it's not specifically listed, it defaults kind of to the nearest equivalent use, which would be community services, which is a conditional use in most zones. So having medical centers listed as conditional uses doesn't really change the actual outcome, but it makes the processing of it a little bit easier. So no big change as far as that goes. That's kind of what I had for the end of the staff report. Again, if there's questions, happy to talk about that. So, yeah.
Do we have any questions on based on Chase's staff report? Anyone else before Andy? We try and let the chair or the president and the vice president go last. Yeah. So go ahead, Rich.
So on your street standards, basically you're saying we want to make the standard, the planter strip next to the curb. There's still an allowance though for a curbside sidewalk, depending on terrain, or say you want to save some trees or stuff like that.
Yes, there are, the proposal itself does call out certain exceptions to when that would not be required. Such as, where is it? In the central business district, since we have the sidewalk that goes all the way up to curb here in central business district. Bridges and crossings of waterways, wetlands, railroads, and other, over crossings of roadways. Hillsides with slopes steeper than 15%. New or replacement sidewalks are less than 100 feet in length. And then where the existing right of way is not wide enough to accommodate the planter strip, and additional right of way dedications can't be reasonably obtained. So there are some exceptions for when that landscaping strip requirement would be not required.
Okay, I know in my past experience, you have a developer, there's big oak trees on the property. And as they lay everything out, trying to meander the sidewalk to try to save those trees. I guess not that I'm a tree hugger, but I understand the amenities and stuff like that. So just to make sure that we don't lose those opportunities.
Yeah, if the planning commission wanted to add an additional exception for preserving of existing, trees, that would not be unreasonable.
Anyone else? Carol?
I have a couple.
Yes, please.
On page 12 of 35 of the development code update. Under affordable housing. There's 3 or 4 changes to that criteria. that basically nullifies the full reason for having that table. If you take it up to 100% of the median income, you don't have any affordable units. And then what are we giving them points for? So you say at or below, and you don't even state a Polk County area median income on A. So you probably should put at least 100% or whatever you're gonna put there. And then you've taken away 80% and 60%, and the recommendation is to go to 100%. Well, the points were given so that we would provide more affordability, and that it would be in a deed restriction that allows it to happen for 15 years. If we make it go to 100%, it defeats the purpose of having the table. So either get rid of the table altogether, or actually do something that actually provides affordability.
I think part of the challenge is that in the, gosh, what is it now, 13 years that we've had this in the code book,
I know.
no one has used it. So I think it's
So-
an attempt to try and make it more palatable to developers.
But it doesn't do anything then. I mean, honestly, if you have no affordability, what's the point?
And I think if you look at where a lot of the new construction is targeted, it's not targeted at the median income, it's really targeted at the upper end of the income spectrum.
And I understand there's reasons why that has to be the case. So, if it's not gonna provide any affordability, then it's just window dressing, and I'm not sure it makes any difference here. And then on page 22 of 35. We're talking about a floodplain, and there's a comment about where the top of the bank is and how that is determined.
Okay,
Um,
can you give me the number from the top of the
yeah,
page?
okay, it's. There isn't a number at the top of the page.
I'm sorry.
4.3,
It's testimony to original proposed amendments.
Testimony. Okay.
section 11, 4.3.020 general requirements, the second page. H and, or no, it's J.
Okay,
12 of 35 is on the bottom of the page. It
gotcha.
took me a while to find.
22 of 35, yeah. So it talks about the top of the bank and how that is to be determined. And they make a good point, if it isn't delineated, but if the floodplain or the floodway isn't delineated. Then the city staff have to determine the top of the bank.
So that's a good question, and there's kind of two sections of code that come into play in that sort of circumstance. So the one is under chapter 2.8, that's the riparian corridors and wetland regulations. And so that does require one that the riparian corridors be delineated on site plans, and that the DSL be involved in approving that. There's also in our code a definition in the definition sections of top of bank. So it's not like an arbitrary, what is the top of bank, like there is an actual definition of it.
Okay.
Now, to the extent that our definition of top of bank, is that the same as the federal definition, is the name of state
I'm sure it
definition?
isn't.
Right, so that's a whole different kettle of fish altogether.
Because then if you have to delineate it for some other reason, then it'd be a different place.
Right, and so that's why I think that, being able to indicate, on the plans as approved by DSL is kind of important. Because it gives sort of that third party neutrality almost.
Right.
It's
someone else's.
Right.
Yes, I get that.
Yeah.
So then,
And we try really hard, I think, not to duplicate DSL's bureaucracy, so.
I get that. Yeah, and if you're stuck on it, it's even worse. And then lastly, if we're making this change and we have something that's in progress that we know will be affected by this code. Does it go by the code that existed when they were approved? Or the code as it is changed right now? Cause I can think of one case right now.
So state law is very clear. They call it the goalpost rule. An application is processed on the by the code that is in effect when the application is deemed
Yeah.
complete, submitted. It has to be complete, yeah. So when an application is complete, that's the code that it is processed under, even if the code changes subsequent to that. So yes,
So we made promises for a site
Mhm.
as the planning commission. And let's say it's recommendations. And then it takes them 2 years to get to the point where they have completed all of the recommended requirements. And it changed since then, and then we can no longer hold them to one of those recommendations. What leads?
so again, whatever was in effect when the application was complete is the code that.
Okay, so the application, not the recommendations.
Right.
Now I'm following.
And if the law changes so that that condition, whatever the case may be, is no longer allowed, as long as it's been fallen in within the goalpost rule and is approved, and in that case, let's say built, then you have a non-conforming use which can continue.
Right, because
Yeah.
we're requiring more than the code shows.
We're changing the code, and if it was developed lawfully to the code when it was to the applicable code for the development, if the code changes after that, they don't have to update and change their development.
But if it's to their advantage, could they?
Yes,
Okay, so they could come back and say, hey, you know, I no longer have to have that much setback and so.
yes, they could submit an application for modification of a prior approval. There's approval criteria in the code for that. And to the extent that the modification is a new application, it would be processed under the code that is in effect when the modification application is received.
And then our recommendations for planning commission would go away and the new stuff.
The new would.
Yeah, okay,
Okay.
that makes sense. I just wanted to understand how that all works.
When you say application, you're talking about the application to the planning commission.
Yes.
Not when they get ready to do, if you
No, no.
do something, so that the planning commission approval essentially sets the development standards.
Earlier than that, it's the date of completion of the application, yeah,
Right,
yeah.
okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Just for clarification, there are standards that an application has to meet in order for be deemed complete. And then that starts a stopwatch and a whole new process once an application is deemed complete. And once it's deemed complete, then it's safe under whatever code exists at that time, and any changes to the code after it's deemed complete are not required unless they would be desired by the applicant to
And
modify.
then they have to come back and have a new application.
But if they come and have a new application and it's deemed complete, then whatever other changes have taken place, they're subject to those and not the
Correct.
ones from before, correct?
Right.
Okay, so it's
However,
a,
a modification application only is, I would say, valid on the subject of the modification. So if they're, proposing to change the configuration of their parking lot, and the height limit in the zone has been reduced, they don't have to reduce the height limit of their building, because the modification is
so
specific to.
a modification to something previously only changes that subject that the modification is dealing with.
Correct.
Oh, that's cool, okay.
Like, if they decide that they want to reduce the size of their alley, because now it's a reduced amount. They can come back into the new application and ask for that. And then they also have to meet any other changes to the code.
No,
It's-
Just the one they asked,
Right.
okay.
So
That's
it
what I was
would be a revision, not a new application.
right.
thinking. Can apply what things they asked.
It would be not be a new applicant, a complete new application. It would be a revision to a previous application. Thank you. Excellent question.
And on that subject, we do have some developers here in town who are, I would say, racing this code update to see which of them will get to the finish line first. As they would like to do some development that would not be permissible under the new code. So we'll see who gets to the finish line first.
What-
I'm guessing that they will because this has taken so long.
I would- Just one follow-up question. Most of the names that exist in the current code came from city council. Is someone gonna talk to city council about the shallots and names?
Yeah, so all of this staff report that was provided to you. The 5 pages of staff report, that all goes to the city council as well, and to the extent that I'm sure there'll be. Some kind of presentation that's given to them, that can certainly be addressed.
Would
verbally
be
as well.
lovely. Thank you.
Just to be clear, yeah, I don't want to double check. The goalpost rule applies when the permit is, when the application is filed, not.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, well,
Option is fine. Yes, yes. And that makes sense. And.
I suppose that does make sense because
Yeah.
we could withhold.
That's right. Completeness and then
Declaration,
change the,
yeah.
yeah, so
Okay.
I
that
thought
makes
that's
sense.
something.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yep.
Thank you. That helps.
Yes.
Any other questions, commissioners?
Just before Andy gets going.
This is my subtle thing after all of you are done, then I.
That's good signaling me. It's like, don't leave me out.
You guys are all preeminent.
On the 20-foot, 25-foot garage setback. Does that affect the rear yard setback on what you've seen? Builders submit? I know it's in my experience. Sometimes certain builders, they have, a dozen house plans. And they all kind of fit that 20-foot with a certain setback in the backyard. Now, if we're moving the house back, are they gonna be able to meet that rear yard setback with those canned plans?
So with detached single family dwellings, I would say it's very rare for a site to have both the minimum front setback and also the minimum rear setback. Usually you have quite a bit more backyard than the minimum. Although not always. And sometimes they'll have a bigger front yard than is required, so you can go bigger. But with detached single families, I would say it's rare to have minimums on both ends. Now, the attached single family product, the townhouses, that's different. The way that we've been seeing Fowler developing those, they've been setting their lots up specifically in relation to the house plans that they have. So those we are seeing minimum setback front and back. That said, those plans would not be affected by this because those garages are accessed off of alleyways, which don't have sidewalks, so would not be affected by the setback requirement for garage openings is specifically garage openings facing streets. So if it's a side loaded garage, that setback doesn't apply. If it's an alley loaded garage, that setback doesn't apply. It's only those that are facing streets. So.
No question. I just want to comment. I felt the staff report was well written. I appreciate the feedback and how you addressed it. I think that that's a good explanation when you present that, when you go to council to let them know the context. I think that'll be good as a presentation. I just wanted to thank you for the detail. I know it was a lot of staff time to compile and color the supporting documentation and the feedback. So thank you.
It's actually, it took, because we use Unicode for our code, which is great in that we can type up proposals and we can enact, amendments, very cleanly. But when you actually try to print that out from the website, it generates a PDF that is just garbage. And so the amount of editing that had to go into this to make it a readable format was just incredible. And the tables in particular are so bad that when it came to the transportation table, this one, I just gave up and redid it in Word. Because there was no way to get that from the website. So there was a tremendous amount of errors. And so hopefully it is readable and comprehensible, but
Thank you
my
for all
goodness.
the support. Appreciate it.
Indeed.
It really did help.
Anyone else? Andy, go ahead.
Two questions. Simple question first, is this 20 to 25 feet? Is this something that's happening other places? And that's why we're considering doing it? Or are we coming up with this on our own? Just curious.
You know, that's a good question. I have not really done research on other communities on this subject. To the extent that pickup trucks seem to be getting longer and longer these days. It wouldn't surprise me if other communities are grappling with that issue. But I have not done any research on that specifically.
Okay, because yeah, it just seems. Yeah, they're getting bigger and bigger, but not everybody can afford one, so. I'm not sure changing the code is that, but I'm gonna let city council deal with that.
Yeah.
The other thing is our near and dear topic of bicycle parking. If the minimum standard is 2 feet by 6 feet. And you talked about covered, are like bicycle lockers included in
Yes.
this?
And so there's specific language in there for bicycle lockers.
But bicycle lockers are bigger than 2 feet wide, aren't they? Because I know, I don't think my handlebars will fit in 2 feet bike locker.
Right, usually because bicycle lockers, they come from a manufacturer who
Mhm.
makes them. It's whatever the manufacturer makes them.
So the 2 by 6 is a minimum size.
I would say the 2 by 6 is a minimum, specifically with when you're looking at racks. But yes. Yeah, bicycle lockers shall be at least 4 feet high, 6 feet long, and 2.5 feet wide.
Okay.
Except that wedge-shaped lockers, because bikes are narrower at one end than the other. Wedge-shaped lockers shall be at least 3 feet wide at the widest end.
Okay, that sounds great. I'm glad that's dealt with. That's all the questions I had.
That's it?
Yeah. I'm gonna get this thing done.
So would it help if there was like a graphic showing those dimensional kind of standards for the bike parking? Because I know that other codes sometimes have that. We could make it graphic.
I think it'd make it a lot easier for
Okay.
developers and council to understand it.
I also think that as long as it's stated clearly that they're minimum standards, I think that would
Yes.
suffice too. But if we
Agreed.
want to add more diagrams to the code, we can certainly do that.
Yeah, so if as part of your recommendation to council, you want to recommend that a graphic be added, I can certainly find one of those or make one of those or have someone make one or.
Borrow one of those.
Sounds like you make them, so you might make Angie actually making it.
I mean, so that's the thing, like if it's in a code somewhere, like there's no copyright, so I can steal from any other city.
Exactly.
On the other hand, if I go and I steal something from like city of Portland, I know Portland's a 4-letter word around here, so that might not be the way. to
Don't
get
say
to
where you got it from.
Say, common practice, yeah.
Salem's a 4-letter word around here too in some cases.
I don't know, but let's be
Okay.
Right.
Anyway,
All right, well, I'll finish up unless any other commissioners have any questions or comments for staff. I'll just say 2 things. Number one, thank you very much. We continued this hearing and we specifically asked for more detailed explanation on, this is just a lot of stuff for a once a month citizen, a group to digest. So I appreciate the extra clarification and I appreciate that the commission continued this so that we could have further discussion. And I'll also note, just as a matter of interest, that there was some folks here in April that had some pushback on some of these, and we specifically left the record open and no additional comments were made. I just want to point that out, that I think that the good staff work was done and that maybe all we needed was a little bit more of a drill down on some of the explanations. And maybe some of these folks that have some reservations about what we're considering here this evening will save their testimony for a brand new public hearing, which will occur at city council at some future date, so.
Indeed, and I did try to provide some response to the written testimony from April. Obviously, there's a whole lot more written testimony than just that, and so going through item by item and responding to that would be a chore. But I did try to provide some response to at least the written testimony from April. So
I would recommend a soft recommendation, that you acknowledge some of the testimony that was received by the planning commission when you forward this to the city council, that there was some.
oh yeah, no, they'll get the entire.
They'll see that. They'll see that. Excellent.
Regarding that, is there any chance we could get a quick summary report of what the council does with this, if they make changes to it? Just for our own understanding of what happens when we put something there, how they changed it, so we can understand that some things are futile and some things are not.
Yeah, we can certainly report back to you on if council made any changes in the adoptions.
I would
process,
sincerely appreciate that.
assuming they adopt anything.
Excellent.
I don't want to say what your recommendation is going to be. I don't want to make any assumptions.
Okay, well. Are there any other questions that the planning commissioners have for staff?
Oh, John, staff.
Okay, well then it's time for deliberation. Let's, we can go around the room, or we can just, anyone that has any comments for deliberation before we entertain, an action. John, go ahead.
No, it's a question for later.
Oh, excellent.
You can make a motion, then we can get to the question.
So where we stand right now is that the testimony was left open for 7 days following April the 11th, if I'm not mistaken. We've now continued that hearing. We've heard additional staff report, including some remarks to testimony that was received last month. And I think that all of our questions and comments have been satisfied. So now it's time for the planning commission to consider a motion to recommend these legislative updates to the city council at a future meeting. Quick question, when do you think this will go to city council? Should we, upon the date that we make the recommendation?
I would have to defer that to Brian Lotta, the city manager. I don't control the city council's schedule.
Is it gonna happen fast, or are we looking June? Okay, so it's gonna happen quickly.
I know that for sure we have to provide at least 20 days advance notice. So that does delay the,
Probably the second meeting in June.
June 17th.
Excellent.
18th, June 17th, solid.
Oh,
and I know
sorry,
we're in budget season, so I don't know if this is gonna get bumped.
Well, I didn't know how backed up council.
That would be bad if it's that push that late for budget. Hopefully it doesn't happen
Next.
before the
So
18th,
sometime
hopefully.
this summer, then we can expect probably a report back on council's final decision.
Yeah, so they'll have a public hearing on the 18th or it's 18th. It's 19th, anyways, that week, and then, they'll have an ordinance, assuming they approve something, ordinance, at the first meeting in July, or the second meeting in July, because the first meeting in July, I think.
council hearing could be on the 20th, because Juneteenth is Monday. Yeah, right. Right.
20th of June, if they approve something that night, so it's an ordinance that goes back in July. For a first reading, second reading, the first meeting in August, and the vote to approve and adopt. In first meeting in August, 30 days to be effective, so this code update on the fastest awful track will be implemented and effective first week.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brian. So commissioners,
I'll make a motion to recommend code updates to city council for adoption.
Did we want to add the thing about the graphics for the bike stuff?
And if there were any changes that you folks thought were reasonable for like the self-storage kind of stuff or anything like. I don't know if you guys were.
Amending the motion, it would be appropriate to get a motion to approve, that if anyone wants to make any changes or additions, that can be done by amendments to the amendment, to the motion.
okay, so we have a motion to recommend. the
As
changes.
presented,
Recommend-
now it is,
recommend-
as it is.
Be to recommend approval of legislative update 2201 as presented by staff.
And that's your motion.
Yep.
Mhm.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, the motion's been made and seconded. Is there any discussion or any, this is our opportunity to add any conditions, whether they be diagrams for bike parking or anything else? Or we can vote on the recommendation as moved and seconded and allow city council to conduct their own public process on these legislative updates, number 22.
I just want it gone. I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay,
If Chase wants to do something about bike stuff
No.
on his own,
No.
because he's a good
No,
servant.
if you vote to recommend it as it is, Chase, that's fine, it goes the way it is.
that's it.
Then I would move an amendment to add the graphics for the bike lockers,
For bike parking,
bike parking.
that it's a minimum standard and diagram.
Yes, thank you, John.
Does it have to be then seconded too?
Yeah, second, we voted on it.
I made the motion, so I'm not gonna second that part. Someone else wants to second.
Thank
it.
So now you have a motion to amend the main motion by adding
graphic.
diagrams, like, yep.
Okay, I
We
think
vote on that one?
Yes.
we're real good at discussion, but we keep our when we get too parliamentarian.
It
gets complicated.
That's what Lane's here. for.
I got
Thank
you, I got you.
Appreciate it.
This would be a vote on the amendment to add, to direct staff to add graphics.
Okay,
Mhm.
so first we're gonna vote on the amended motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed the same? Okay, so the.
Now the
amendment
motion
to
is
the motion.
as proposed with the addition of the bike parking
Yes.
graphics, yeah.
Are we gonna do we need to discuss?
If there's more discussion, now is the time. Yes.
Discuss the amendment, you just voted.
No,
on
no.
it. Yeah.
No, no. it
Yeah.
is a-
This is-
Oh, yeah, you keep discussing, yeah, sure, the
Any
motion
more
is.
discussion on
I
the,
don't want to make an amendment, but we can just reiterate to city council about the legal problem. If we say may instead of shall, that would be lovely.
Well, I'm assuming it'll be the same presentation where you're trying to be clear and directive type of language, right?
I don't know, Brian, am I gonna get like an hour to talk to them?
I don't know that you want to go down the list, but I think that's a good point, though.
Well, I would just like to thank Carol for her very understanding of the bit about the affordable housing. I thought that was great and I don't know if we can do anything about it, but
And maybe we
I
can-
appreciate you putting it in the record and I really appreciate your understanding of all that stuff and sharing that.
Thank you.
I mean, if you guys want to recommend not moving forward with that part of the change, certainly that could be part of your recommendation, like.
well,
We
we've
have
got
options.
we've got a motion right now to make a recommendation. With the amendment that we have already voted on, so I say we go
We could
forward.
make another amendment if
We
somebody
certainly
wants to.
could.
She doesn't want to, that's good enough for me.
I am going
I
to,
don't think it'll go forward. If they're not using it, then maybe we'll just leave it as is.
I thought that was a good point, that it hasn't been, I think there are other means and incentives to do it other than code. If it hasn't been applied, then that was nice.
Yes.
The other thing is, it looks like it added a bunch of points in that system. I mean, all the point totals were up, so that might incentivize people to actually look at using it.
Maybe.
So that's me ever hopeful adding that in there.
Push out.
okay, so let's have a roll call vote on our recommendation to city council with approval as amended. Let's have a roll call vote to move this on to city council.
John Schulte,
Yes.
Rich Spofford,
Yes.
Carol Kowash,
Yes.
Tori Banford,
Yes.
Mary Newell,
Yes.
Andy Grow,
Yes.
John Swanson.
Yes.
Carries
Okay,
unanimously.
the motion carries unanimously. This will be recommended to the city council, who will be hearing it directly, and we will have a report back sometime this fall. Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you very much, Chase. Excellent job. I think that
As always.
I think the continuation of this was well founded and excellent. I'm a lot more comfortable today than I was a month ago when we talked about this the first time. So I sincerely appreciate the extra staff work, including transposing from a shanky website to something that's actual
It's
legend.
okay. There were only like 53 pages.
It's not that. All right, so let's move on to our next agenda item, number 7, commissioners' comments. Does any planning commissioners have any comments for the good of the order?
I actually have a question for Ben. Did we get any farther with getting a transcript or a video of the commissioner training that happened?
You were CC'd on my last email to them. I've heard nothing back.
I remember seeing the email,
Yeah.
so thank you for CCing me.
Yeah,
And I guess I gotta go beat down their door to get my $20 back.
I guess so. I will try to give that person a
Okay.
call. I have a hunch there might have been a staff turnover situation. We'll see.
Got it. Okay.
Any other commissioner comments? Chuck?
On that related point. So some training was held. I was out of town, I couldn't be there. I don't know that I have a hunger for repeating that training. But what I've been waiting for 2 years is an opportunity like a roundtable discussion here at some point of questions that still are unanswered in my mind. And someday, can we have an opportunity to cut aside half hour? It doesn't necessarily have to be structured, just to talk about some of the high level things that have never been cleared. Someday.
A work session.
Sure, sure.
Excellent. I think
Off
that's
the record, just for clarity.
On the record, but yeah,
whatever.
give everyone a chance to ask questions.
Certainly, I think that's a terrific idea.
And we've done,
I'd be happy to facilitate that.
we've done field trips in the past. We could do something like that on a non-commission day too, or would that be appropriate?
Well, I think you're just talking about a conversation here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And so it's not open-ended and forever. Maybe everybody had the chance to contribute a couple of questions perhaps to you. And so we know what the questions are, and that's what the discussion is about, so it doesn't go forever.
Okay.
It's balanced.
Well, we're blessed with expertise.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you very much, Lane, and your willingness to do that. So let's get that on a future agenda that's not too heavy. We can have a work session on land use planning in Oregon and Dallas in particular. And we can answer some of your questions.
Great.
I appreciate the ask, and I agree with you that it's something that we should do. Not just one time for new commissioners, but periodically, just to make sure that we're all refreshing ourselves. Cool. Any other commissioner comments this evening? Any staff comments? Okay, well, that concludes our planning commission meeting for this evening, May the 9th. Last time I asked for a motion
Don't need
to adjourn the meeting. I currently serve in a different jurisdiction where they actually go through some of that stuff. I think that's where I picked it up.
No, if you've completed the agenda, then you can just adjourn.
Okay, well, I'm not gonna write anything more to continue the agenda, so I declare the Dallas Planning Commission to be closed at 8:35 PM, and we'll see you all next Monday.
Don't get drunk on the power.
We try not to.
Elevator.
Okay.